All right, welcome to your lecture material on marriage, cohabitation, and divorce. So I picked this image for the title slide because it's from a tapestry, a famous medieval tapestry called The Unicorn in Captivity. And people have speculated as to what it's supposed to represent. And one idea is that it represents matrimony or marriage, that the unicorn is choosing to stay within this low fence. And you can see this at the cloisters in New York City. I bet you've already heard about John Gottman, but this is an opportunity to read a chapter from his most famous book with his key Four Horsemen idea. Gottman's really writing from a heterosexual perspective, and he's suggesting that women are more likely to do two of the horsemen, to be critical or contemptuous, and that men are more likely to do the other two of the horsemen, defend or stonewall. But as a therapist, we notice that people meet this criteria maybe 2/3 of the time, heterosexual couples, but about a third of the time, that's not the case. And we'll be talking more about this in upcoming lectures. So I'm wondering kind of what's been your experience either with straight couples, or what we also notice is this pattern happens in same-sex couples too. So it's not strictly a kind of sex-based phenomenon. Okay, so this lecture is divided into 3 sections, one on marriage, in which we'll discuss marriage rates, the marriage benefit idea, marital expectations, and then a second section on cohabitation, where we'll discuss cohabitation rates, reasons for cohabitation, cohabitation and divorce, and cohabitation and relationship quality. And then lastly, we're going to talk about divorce, again, divorce rates, predictors of divorce, and the process of divorcing. Let's get started with marriage. As much as possible, when I'm talking about married couples, I'll be including research on both straight couples and gay couples. You can see as of 2021 that about, in terms of the recently married couples, that about 3%, 3.5% were gay couples. Slightly more of those were lesbian couples than gay male couples, and then the vast majority of recently married couples being straight couples. So the crude marriage rate is the number of marriages that occur in a population during the given year. So this isn't all people married. This is people who got married in a given year divided by 1,000. And so you can see the dramatic changes in marriage over time. Just some interesting things to note. You can see that around the time of the Great Depression, marriage rates dropped, maybe because people couldn't afford to get married. And then right around the time of World War II, there was a huge spike in marriage. And these were the kind of like, marry me, baby, I'm headed off to war marriages. And there was a resulting spike in divorce, following World War II. And then you can see the 1950s being after that spike of World War II, still a time of kind of higher marriage rates that then really began to decline through the 1960s, early 70s, then kind of sweep back up again, and then kind of follow a steady decline down to our current time. So one question that I'll be asking you to think about, and it may be one of your debate question options for the debate assignment, is marriage becoming obsolete? Okay, so a little bit more on marriage rates. You can see from the graph there that even over a 30-year period from 1990 to 2019, we're seeing declines in the number of people who are married, number of U.S. adults who are married, increases in the number who are cohabitating, and also increases in the number who are unpartnered, and so they're not living with a partner, nor are they married. There's a greater growth for unpartnered men than there is for unpartnered women, except for Black women, who are more likely to be unpartnered than Black men. In terms of marriage rates, as you saw for different sex couples, those are declining. For same-sex couples, those initially spiked after the legalization of marriage, and then have remained, as I understand it, fairly steady. It's still hard for me to find accurate numbers on this. It is clear that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender adults are less likely to marry compared to straight cisgender individuals. I can't get a solid number on the percentage who are married. Gallup, for example, says that 10% of LGBT adults are married. That seems kind of low to me because the overall percentage of adults married is around 50%. So I can tell you that it's lower. I can't tell you exactly what it is at this time. So marriage is either declining for straight couples or lower for same-sex couples. And so, what are the possible mechanisms around this? So one is just that people are delaying marriage. So when you survey the whole population, if people aren't getting married until they're closer to 30, then we've got a whole group of adults in their 20s who are just saying they're not married that are throwing off the numbers. So that could be one piece. Of the people who are delaying marriage, we do see the majority of never married adults saying that they want to marry someday. So it's not always for lack of interest. And we also see that the median age of forming a partnership, like in the form of a cohabitation, is still kind of in its mid-20s. So it's not like people aren't forming relationships, they're not getting married. However, we are also seeing just an increase in the never married population. So if we look at middle-aged and older adults, we've got more people who have never been married. So yes, this kind of leads to this question about your thoughts. Are you married or are you hoping to marry one day? And what's your decision making around that? Okay, so take a look at this graph at the median age at first marriage from 1890 to present. And I find it interesting that the age of marriage, for example, was higher in 1890 than it was in 1950, 1960. That confirms, Stephanie Kuntz's assertion that we talked about in historical context, that the 1950s was kind of a cultural anomaly, and it was an unusual time where people were suddenly getting married at a younger age and then having kids at a younger age. So as of 2022, the median age of first marriage for men is about 2 years older than women, so 30.5, and women was 28.5. Okay, so why are we seeing declining or lower marriage rates? So one big reason is what's called the deinstitutionalization of marriage, that marriage is no longer required to be a real adult. We have less stigma for being unmarried. We don't use words now like spinster, bachelor, old maid. I remember, though, hearing that word when I was a kid growing up. There was a man who would come over to my parents' house who worked with my dad, and he was probably in his 30s or 30s, and I was confused as to why he wasn't married, and my parents would say he's a bachelor. In hindsight, he may have been gay, I don't know. We also know that there's high divorce rates. So divorce isn't rising overall, but it is rising for some subpopulations, as we'll see. And people are worried, right, about divorce, so they're either delaying marriage or not getting married. And then economics. So marriage is particularly kind of in crisis or declining for lower income, lower education couples. And so this is because of kind of two phenomena. Men in the working class, their wages have stagnated. They've had higher unemployment. They've had rising incarceration, which means they're kind of less marriageable because we associate marriage with financial stability, essentially. So whether gay or straight, working class men are less likely to be marriageable, and working class women are more educated and financially independent than in the past, so they may delay marriage or not marry, whether gay or straight. Okay, Cohen and Pepin researched the marriage markets for Black women in more urban areas, and they, noted this kind of increasing marriage gap. So the marriage and for Black and white individuals. So heterosexual marriage is declining for both populations, but it's declining at a steeper rate for Black populations than white. And so the reasons for this are that, big reason is just that we have less unmarried Black marriageable men compared to white men. And this is because our incarceration rates have increased fourfold since the 1970s with the war on drugs, and this has disproportionately affected young Black men, which then reduces their income and assets and leads to lower marriage rates. And so if you are a straight Black woman who wants to marry a Black man, you're facing a tough marriage market. But before we go on, let's talk about who's still getting married early. And so these are emerging adults with parents without college degrees. And I should say by early, we're saying kind of before the age of 24. These can be those living in the South or rural areas, or who are religiously conservative Protestants, or who are Mormon. Military service members often get married earlier and are incentivized to. There's benefits for married partners, not cohabiting partners, or more benefits for married partners. And then whites and Latinos or Chicanos are more likely to get married earlier. You're less likely to marry early if you're Black American or Asian American, or if both of your parents have college degrees. Those are the lowest rates of early marriage. And if you live in a more urban or suburban environment. Research does suggest that waiting until you're 21 to get married really does help decrease the likelihood of divorce. All right, so test yourself here with this question: why are marriage rates declining? So if we talk through the options, there are other acceptable options to marriage. That's the correct answer. Marriage is not in vogue. You could make the case, but it's probably not the best answer. High-income couples are not choosing to marry. In fact, we see that more trend for low-income couples rather than high-income couples. Men have less incentive to marry than in the past. Actually, that's more likely to be women who have less incentive to marry because they're earning money. You might pause and think what you've heard about the benefits of marriage, if you've heard about it in an HDFS class or you've read a headline. But it's been an oft-touted kind of finding that, being married as compared to being single confers greater benefits for like your mental and physical health. But more recent reanalysis has basically suggested these positive effects were overstated or maybe are declining. And so what we really see is that the marriage benefit is for those that are happily married, not for those that are unhappily married. And we might see similar benefits from close relationships, such as a stable cohabiting partner or close friendships. And so if you look at the happiness rankings there, you can see that, yes, there might be an edge in happiness anyway for people who are happily married or partnered. But the people who are divorced or separated or unhappily married, and presumably all of those have been unhappily married, are actually worse off than if they had just remained single. So the marriage benefit is more narrow than we thought. One, I think, really interesting question from the marriage literature is about what your expectations should be for your marriage. Should you have high expectations or should you have lower expectations? And a lot of this is in the context of what's going to put you more at risk for divorce. So for example, some people think that, when people place too high of expectations on marriage, then that's going to lead them to be dissatisfied and that's going to lead to divorce. So one answer might be to lower their expectations. But then other researchers like Gottman say, no, my research actually shows that the people who have higher standards and higher expectations actually have the best marriages, not the worst marriages. And Carney has suggested that, now that we don't have to maybe always just think of marriage as about survival, having more expectations for our close relationships, whether that's our marriages, our relationships with parents, extended family, kids, it's normal to maybe expect more now, And then other researchers have said, maybe this is a more appropriate expectation for higher income couples who don't have to worry about economic survival and less of a reasonable expectation for lower income couples. I think one thing that it kind of can come down to, and researchers have distinguished between the difference between having idealistic high expectations versus realistic high expectations. So a realistic high expectation might be, yeah, you listen to me when I need to process and you're there for me. An idealistic high expectation might be that you always know exactly what I need, which sounds great, but is, not always going to be what's going to happen in reality. So there was an article that popped up on my social media some time back. And the headline was, "My husband is not my soulmate." And the author was making this point, like, I don't need to think of my husband as my soulmate. I can have friendships that are fulfilling, and I can still have a good marriage if my husband's not my soulmate. And so I think this leads to an interesting conversation about kind of the difference between idealistic expectations and realistic expectations. And is thinking of your partner as a soulmate idealistic, or is it realistic? And, what do you think about that kind of partner as soulmate idea? As a lover of YA fantasy fiction, I'm all in on the soulmate. And in fact, I've always thought of my husband that way. And sometime recently we were in a conversation with extended family, and my aunt said something like to us, like, wow, you two just totally belong together. And I was thinking, like, yeah, because we're soulmates. And my husband said, yeah, but if we hadn't met each other, we probably would have met somebody similar and it all would have worked out. I was like, what are you talking about? So you may not be in on the soulmate idea, but it's really appealing to me. All right, so we're on to our second topic, which is cohabitation. Okay, so we're going to just start by looking at some trends in cohabitation. We've got two slides like this one from the U.S. Census Bureau from 1968 up until 2018. This first slide is on emerging adults ages 18 to 24. The next slide will cover the next older age group. So what we can see here is obviously big declines in being married at this age and pretty significant increases in cohabitation. And this does just make sense because this is 18 to 24, and the average age of first marriage is around 28 to 30. So it's much less likely that people are going to be married during this time, although some people are. And as we're going to see, we've just got increasing trends associated with cohabitation across all age groups. So this just shows us the next age group, ages 25 to 34, and we can see that in 1968, 80% of people in this age group were married, and 0% were living with a partner. And now that rate of marriage is cut in about half, and proportionally the rate of cohabitation has really skyrocketed. And we can also add these percentages up and just note that about 45% of young adults ages 25 to 34 aren't living with a partner or a spouse. Okay, so here's three graphs from the Pew Research Center. The first one is surveying adults ages 18 to 44, and the second two are for all adults. And so these are showing us kind of a huge change in our society regarding cohabitation. So the first graph shows a reversal in the trend. So for, earlier in 2002, it was still more common to have experienced marriage than cohabitation. But as of, maybe 15 years later, it became more common to have experienced cohabitation than marriage. We can see that the vast majority of Americans think it's acceptable to live together even if you don't plan to get married, with a very slight preference, that people eventually get married, that you might be a little bit better off on average, Americans are saying. This is a huge change in the field over these last 30 years. This is one of the big changes that I've witnessed. When I entered this field in the mid-1990s, becoming a marriage and family therapist, I went to a marriage conference, and as I remember it, the whole theme was cohabitation puts people at risk for divorce, and so we need to get them to get married. So how can we encourage everybody to get married? Okay, there were a few decades where cohabitation rates were really going up. More so for some ages than others. Younger ages started cohabitating earlier. Older ages were a little slower, and are still having lower rates of cohabitation. And then since about 2015, we can see that, or maybe even a little before that, we can see that cohabitation rates have really plateaued. Looking at cohabitation rates by race and ethnicity, we can see that cohabitation is somewhat common across all ages and all racial and ethnic groups. But we can see that clearly we've got the highest cohabitation rates for white individuals, the lowest rates for Black and Asian individuals, with Hispanic and bi multiracial being kind of in the middle. Although cohabitation can still be controversial for some people, the majority of marriages and remarriages now begin as cohabiting relationships. It's around 75%. So it's considered a modal or normal path to marriage. So when you think back to life course perspective, the family stages, this is now a new family stage, essentially, cohabiting before you get married, or just cohabiting and not going on to get married. And so we also know that childbearing is rising. About 40% of cohabiting couples do have children. And yet we also know that many cohabitors aren't thinking of marriage. And so we'll talk about some of the different reasons for cohabiting. This graph just shows us the percentage of marriages beginning with cohabitation over time. And so we can see that, around the early 1970s, it was about 11%. And then now it's pretty close to 3/4. It was around early 90s, actually, when over half of first marriages were preceded by cohabitation. And I think it's interesting because cohabitation was still so stigmatized during that time, and even up until probably the last 12 years. And so it's almost like it takes research and societal perception kind of a while to get caught up to the changes that are happening. So let's talk about some of the varying reasons why people might cohabit. So for some, it's a precursor to marriage, right? We know we are planning to get married, but we're saving some money, or we're waiting till we finish school, or, a little bit older. And this is more common for people who are younger and who have higher education. It used to be that people were more likely to be engaged before they cohabited, but less people are engaged now before they start living together. It can also be a substitute for marriage. Like, we actually aren't planning on getting married. Perhaps we've been divorced and we don't want to go through that again, or maybe we're older and we're worried about, joining our finances through marriage, and what will that matter for the kind of inheritance patterns, or we just maybe don't ever anticipate kind of having enough money to get married, if we have a goal of that. And so since we have less money, we're just planning on kind of cohabiting, or it just may not be our value. I remember my father-in-law came to visit us, and he had been divorced twice, and then he had a new girlfriend. And when they arrived, they had rings on their left hands. And we said, "Oh my gosh, are you engaged?" And he was like, "Oh no, we're not doing that again. We are entangled," So they were committed, but they weren't going down the marriage path. And then the last one is, maybe like many of you have experienced, is cohabitation as intensive dating. And this can happen fairly quickly, within a few months, that people can move in together. And this can be about commitment, like we're taking our relationship to the next level, or it can be about convenience, like your place is closer to work and I'm over here all the time anyway, or I don't like my roommate, or it's cheaper if we share a space. Or it could be a mix of both. And research used to say that basically having a more committed and intentional cohabitation is better for long-term relationship success. And I think that's probably still true. But now that cohabitation is so ubiquitous or common, I'm not sure how significant that finding is anymore. So I used to spend a lot of time in this class talking about the links between cohabitation and divorce, where it was still significant, where it wasn't significant. Now I can tell you that it's pretty much non-significant, the links between cohabitation and divorce. When we look at the older research on race and ethnicity, Phillips and Sweeney found that there actually was never a correlation that was significant between cohabitation and divorce for Latinas or Black women. And then, yes, recent studies focusing on kind of younger cohorts really have confirmed no or low relationship. There's little or to no relationship between cohabitation and divorce, especially for men, in terms of putting you more at risk. And then for some women, cohabiting is associated with actually the opposite, a decreased risk of divorce rather than increased risk of divorce. And this is particularly for Black women who have less education, or women who are raised in a single parent or step family household. Okay, this slide kind of ties into some of our upcoming material on divorce, but research has consistently found that cohabiting couples report lower relationships quality or satisfaction compared to married couples, although that gap could be narrowing. And this is in part due to selection bias. If you are an unhappy cohabiting couple, you're less likely to move on to the next step to marriage. So people who are getting married are more likely to have been a happy cohabiting couple. And people who are cohabiting also are more likely to break up than people who are married, which again can be a selection bias. And it can also be that people are, in cohabitation for different reasons, for more intensive dating or more convenience. Cohabitation is correlated with some other risk factors for divorce. If you're cohabiting, you're more likely to have less money on average because you may be feeling like you need to have more money to get married. And so economic disadvantage is correlated, as we're going to see, is correlated with divorce. You are also more likely to have children from prior relationships, and kids alone can be a challenge for relationship well-being. And certainly if you're raising kids in a blended family situation, that can create additional challenges for relationship satisfaction. And cohabitors are more likely to have been divorced in the past, and prior divorce predicts your likelihood to some extent of future divorce, although of course lots of people get married a second time and stay married. So I'm curious as to how you and your family think about cohabitation, and if there's agreement or disagreement or mixed. I've generally seen, as I've asked this question over the years, that more and more students and their families are approving of cohabitation. I'll just tell you quickly that cohabiting with my husband Jordan the year before we got married was one of my 2 rebellious acts of my whole life. The other one was sneaking out of church to go to Burger King. And so this was one of the really tough in my family. I had been raised against cohabitation, and I wasn't planning on cohabiting with Jordan. We knew we were going to get married. We'd already been together like 3 or 4 years, living in separate apartments. But then Jordan bought a cute house here in Old Town Fort Collins, like a house built in the 1920s, and it had these beautiful wood floors. And we knew we were going to get married in a year. And so he was like, well, I guess I'm just going to move in there with my roommate, Mike. And I was like, wait, you're going to move into this cute house with Mike, and then a year from now he's going to move out and I'm going to move in? And I remember the moment where I realized, I think we're going to have to cohabit. I'm going to have to move in with you. We were on Laurel at the Rainbow Restaurant, for those of you who are here in Fort Collins, sitting across from each other when it just hit me. And I'm sure I was crying. And my husband was saying, or it wasn't my husband at the time, Jordan was saying, I'm okay with this. I'm fine with this. It's totally up to you. But led to a lot of tearful conversations in my family. And my dad wouldn't visit us the whole year before we got married. He didn't come to the house, and obviously they're in Florida, so that wasn't like a huge thing. But my mom came to visit us. So it's definitely the most controversial thing I've ever done. All right, so now we're on to our third and final section on divorce and the uncoupling process. So the divorce rate is calculated like the marriage rate. In any given year, it's the number of divorces per 1,000 married females. And this is how we've always calculated marriage and divorce, and it's very heterosexist because it's presuming that there's a man and a woman in each couple, and it doesn't want to double count divorces or marriages. So it's always only counted it by females, which means in our current, unless we've adjusted this in the current way that we count things, I'm not sure how well we are taking into account, for example, same-sex marriages and divorces. Hopefully we have figured that out. Okay, so remember, lower divorce rates, when we look at this throughout history, doesn't mean that marriages were happy. People could have been unhappy but staying together, or sometimes there was desertion or abandonment, but on the books we were still married. When you actually take into account death, like we talked about in the historical context PowerPoint, the actual rate of marital dissolution, the ending of a relationship, has been relatively constant from the mid-1800s to the late 1900s. So because marriages used to end more with death, now more divorce, but either way, marriages were ending. So what we can see by looking at this graph, divorce really increased during the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, right? Then they diminished during the Great Depression because people couldn't afford to get divorced. They rose after World War II because we had a spike in impulsive marriages when people were headed off to war. And so then when people came back, I was like, okay, this isn't going to work out. Divorce took a little, upswing. Then it really dropped in the 1950s during, that time of that was a cultural anomaly, an unusual time of stability. Then divorce made its big, increase from 1960 to 1980. So you can see that dramatic increase over a 20-year period. And then it peaked in 1980. And I want you to really take note of that. People often miss that date on an exam because I think it's earlier than we think it should be. We feel like, no, divorce is still rising, or divorce peaked just recently, but it actually peaked quite a long time ago and then has been declining ever since. Partly that is because we are marrying less. So lower marriage rates do also mean lower divorce rates. So that can be a factor, and maybe why we don't perceive it as declining as much as it is. Now about 40% of first marriages end in divorce, so not the 50% that sometimes we hear. But there are higher rates of divorce for second marriages, and then even higher rates of divorce for third marriages. Okay, so here's some additional trends around divorce rates. So of course, yes, divorce rates are falling overall, especially for young adults, but not for middle-aged adults and older adults. Those, as you can see from this graph, are rising, and it's rising also for lower income individuals, which we're going to talk more about. We also are seeing that following a divorce, people are becoming increasingly more likely to cohabit rather than remarry. And we're also seeing an increased divergence in the rates of divorce for Black women and other women. So there didn't used to be as much of a divorce gap in a racial difference in terms of divorce rates, but now divorce rates for Black women are significantly higher than for other racial and ethnic groups. And we are also seeing higher divorce rates for same-gender couples, especially lesbian couples, who are more likely to marry compared to gay couples, but also more likely to divorce. Let's talk a little bit more about how divorce rates relate to socioeconomic status, so money and education, basically. And so as we've talked about, divorce rates increased for couples in all social classes in the 1960s and the 1970s. Once divorce peaked in the 1980s, then the rates began to diverge. Divorce declined or at times remained steady for well-educated couples, but it continued to rise for women, because that's how we're tracking divorce, without college degrees. And this seems to be a trend around the world, except in countries with traditional attitudes about gendered roles. And in those cases, highly educated women are more likely to divorce than less educated women. A little bit more on the relationship between women's education and marriage and divorce. So for most of the 20th century, the 1900s, women who had higher education were far less likely to be married than their less educated counterparts. Basically, there was a penalty for a woman to getting college degrees or advanced degrees. But in 2010, we saw the reversal of part of that. College-educated women were still less likely to marry in 2010, but also became less likely to divorce. And then just 2 years later, the whole trend, completely reversed, in that college-educated women were more likely to marry, and then considerably less likely to divorce. So now there is a benefit for college-educated women in terms of increased likelihood of marriage and less likelihood of divorce. Okay, so you can test yourself on these. Who is the most likely to divorce? College-educated woman, college-educated man, woman without a college degree, or a man over the age of 55. And from this list, it would be a woman without a college degree. Let's dive a little bit more into why lower income couples are more likely to divorce. I've been kind of curious, why is this, over the years? And some of this we've touched on already. I will tell you that the marriage movements of the 1990s and early 2000s were often targeting lower income couples and either encouraging them to marry or trying to prevent them from getting divorced. But they weren't really grounded in research on low-income couples. They were making assumptions, and they were just assuming that low-income couples need better communication skills, or they don't value marriage as much, and we need to get them to value marriage. And so these programs weren't very effective, even though we spent, lots of money on them. There were federal funds for that. I think they were also kind of patronizing in some ways, in my opinion. So we started researching more and found out that communication skills and valuing marriage aren't really the primary drivers for why low SES couples don't marry or have higher rates of divorce. And the key factors seem to be first, with more women in the workforce and able to support themselves, they don't have to stay in a relationship that's, not satisfying, because they are able to support themselves on their own. So, especially if maybe their partner isn't employed or, isn't having a steady job, then it becomes even less necessary to stay. If this was a couple that married early, before the age of 21, that can also be a risk factor. And then, like we talked about under the family stress model, chronic economic stress can be challenging for couples and for families. Like we've discussed, it's hard to be your best self. That affects your couple relationship, your parenting. And then similarly, the vulnerability stress adaptation model developed by Carney and Bradbury says that lower income spouses are more likely to have experienced childhood trauma and have poor mental health, which is going to, could potentially create challenges for their marriage. They're going to have more stress, like, for example, just even stress in the neighborhood or stress around jobs, because they don't have as much autonomy and less resources to deal with that. And then they will maybe show up because of this increased stress, with more negativity or criticism in the couple relationship. So, as we've talked about, the divorce rate isn't rising, but it's high. And so why is it high in the United States? And there's a few different reasons that are considered kind of the primary reasons. One is, yes, the decreasing influence of religion, but there is mixed research on that. Some religious groups show also similar rates of divorce. No-fault divorce laws are probably one of our biggest factors, and we're going to talk about that more. Women's increased economic independence. So women file for divorce 60 to 70% of the time. So if they have a way to get out of an unhappy marriage, they might take it. And then, like we've talked about already with the Stephanie Kuntz reading in The History of Marriage, once marriage came to be about love instead of politics or money or property exchange or duty or survival, then marriages can end, for the lack of love. And then, just like we just talked about, stress in low-income marriages, so financial stress can also be contributing to higher divorce rates. Okay, so I always find no-fault divorce and fault divorce pretty fascinating. So it was in the 1970s that every state in the United States passed a no-fault divorce law. But prior to that, one partner always had to be guilty. And then a marriage could be declared unworkable and a divorce could be granted. So prior to no-fault divorce, you had to demonstrate, and it depended on the state, cruelty, abandonment, addiction, affairs, adultery, crime or imprisonment, or, for example, insanity. And so once we could have a no-fault divorce, right, where no one was at fault, also called like the irretrievable breakdown or irreconcilable differences, then it made divorce easier for people to obtain. Because obviously, if you were just unhappy in your marriage, it was hard to lie and say, somebody did something wrong, someone was at fault. And those who were at fault were less likely to get child custody, or they might have to pay more alimony. And so, the thought of lying to take a hit just to get out of a bad relationship or an unhappy relationship, kept a lot of people in it. Technically, interestingly, before the no-fault divorce law passed, because only one person could be at fault, if two people were at fault, they weren't allowed to divorce. So that was the case in California that actually spurred their no-fault divorce. There was a couple in 1952 that both were alleging cruelty of the other, and so they were denied divorce. But then the California Supreme Court reversed that decision, and California became the first state to pass no-fault divorce. And people did engage in what's called collusive divorces, even though it was illegal to lie, because you're lying in a court of law. They would collude, often around pretending that adultery that had happened. So in New York, prior to the 1930s, adultery was the only reasonable grounds for divorce. And so a husband would check into a hotel, he'd hire a lover, maybe, a prostitute, for example, or a sex worker, and then they'd have a maid or a photographer kind of show up and catch them in the act. And the report would indicate that the man was in his underwear, his pajamas, and the woman was in a state of undress. And so then they would be granted a divorce. Also, during this time in New York, annulment was another common option. If you could prove, quote unquote, that your marital consent was obtained by force, duress, or fraud, or if one of the parties was incapable of being married or was a lunatic. And so in New York City or New York State in 1950, there were actually more annulments that year than divorces. So the summary is no-fault divorce laws and allowed us it made divorce more obtainable. Most states now only have no-fault divorce laws, but there are a few states, New York included, as I understand it, that still have the option for fault. So you can get a no-fault divorce or you can get a fault divorce. And I don't know how common it is to get a fault divorce. So in the next few slides, I'll be talking about what predicts divorce, what increases our risk for it. And I'll be drawing heavily on a review article by Lee and Spara, where they divide kind of the risk factors into three categories: interpersonal within us as an individual, interpersonal in our relationship, and external stressors. Okay, I personally think talking about intrapersonal within us characteristics is kind of stressing because some of us have these, predictors of divorce. And so you might find yourself worrying about it. But just remember, self-awareness and therapy can go a long way to change, old or inherited patterns. So when we think about the three big things within us that are, correlated with divorce, right? The first one are some personality traits, and personality seems to be about 50% genetic, that we inherit these from our biological parents, and then maybe 50% environmental. So that's based on twin studies. All right, so you may have learned about the big 5 personality traits in other classes. We don't focus on that so much in HDFS, but the first 4 on this list are some of the big 5, right? So more negative emotionality, higher neuroticism, lower agreeableness. Neuroticism is like anxiety. Lower agreeableness, lower conscientiousness, all correlated with a, slightly higher risk of divorce. And then lower constraint, which I think of as higher impulsivity, also correlated. So some personality traits that can put us at risk. Attachment insecurity, both in childhood and in adulthood. And we're going to be focusing on attachment security in adulthood and what we can be doing to achieve it, especially if we did not get that during childhood. And then having experienced our own parents' divorce, or perhaps more specifically parental conflict. I think that's, more contentious divorce probably have more of a negative effect or a stronger correlation. But experiencing your own parental divorce on average increases your risk of divorce by about 50%. And so that intergenerational transmission of divorce can be both genetic, maybe some of these more challenging personality traits, but it can also, and that might be about a third of the risk. And then it can be just living in more contentious environments or not having good role models at times. Okay, so you did the Gottman reading this week about Gottman's 4 horsemen. And when we think about interpersonal, like within the relationship, the couple relationship predictors of divorce, Gottman's 4 horsemen are some of the big ones. And they also represent a pursue, withdraw, or demand withdraw pattern that has been shown to predict divorce when it gets exacerbated. Negative attributions. So what's the story you're telling yourself about your partner? If they're distracted, are you telling yourself they don't care? Or you're just like, oh, they've got a lot on their mind. The more negative attributions we make, the more, the more that predicts divorce. So it's important to keep that in mind and potentially catch ourselves in that and reframe, those attributions, shift them. And then obviously lower commitment or perceiving that our partners have lower commitment can be correlated with increased risk of divorce, which makes sense. So there are a lot of potential stressors that could put a couple at risk, and these are the ones that just have the most research. So financial strain, which we've talked about already, and then work hours and stress. So work stress can increase kind of make it more likely to have poor communication or kind of withdraw from couple activities, like you're just exhausted, so you're just kind of zoned out and watching TV. You can also be more irritated, more angry. And so that there's a big concept in the work family literature called work family spillover. And so if you're having negative work family spillover, it can definitely influence a lot of things: child outcomes, relationship satisfaction, personal well-being. We know that the transition to parenthood can, negatively impact marital happiness. That's only for like about half couples on average. So about half of couples at least don't experience that. Their marital happiness stays about the same or even gets better. And then the last one is infidelity or affairs, which we'll talk about more later in the semester. There is a reciprocal relationship between divorce proneness, that's kind of your risk for divorce, and infidelity. So having an affair is more likely in a marriage where partners are considering divorce, and then having an affair increases that risk of divorce. It's the number one reason people give for filing for divorce. Okay, so you can test yourself here on this. What's a key predictor of divorce highlighted in lecture? Was it extroversion? Was it high SES, parental divorce, or substance use? And in terms of what we highlighted in lecture, it was parental divorce. I don't know the research off the top of my head on substance use, although it might, I'm guessing it's a potential risk factor, but maybe not as strong as your own parents divorcing. All right, you're almost there. These last slides are on the process of uncoupling or divorce, and they're all on qualitative research studies on the process of divorce or uncoupling where people have been interviewed, typically about divorce. So this is older, from the 1980s actually. Diane Bond did a research study where she interviewed straight couples, divorced and separated men and women, about how their relationship came apart. She did suggest that it applies to same-sex couples as well, so you can see what you think and you can see if this still seems relevant. I still find it useful in thinking about the uncoupling process. And so these were kind of the 5 things that she mentioned. They might come in this order, but of course they might not. But the first, it might be that one or both people are kind of harboring secret unhappiness. And they're maybe not talking about it, but they're starting to realize that maybe this isn't what they thought it was going to be, or, not fulfilling their hopes and dreams. And then someone makes the initial disclosure. Maybe there's an initiator who kind of indicates that they're not happy. It could be coming across as a complaint. It could be trying to correct the shortcomings of their partners, that they become a better match. And I think sometimes this message is received clearly, like, oh my gosh, you're really unhappy. We need to do something. I need to do something. I need to change. We need to do something. We need to go to therapy. We need to whatever. But sometimes I think this is not, the other person does not realize how unhappy you are. The receiver doesn't get it. And so then they're caught off guard later when you're like, I think I want a divorce. Like, what? What are you talking about? And you're thinking, I told you, 6 months ago that I was fed up with blah, blah, blah. But the person didn't realize, I didn't realize you were that fed up. So anyway, I always tell my husband, you make sure that if you're really, unhappy, that you tell me super clearly, because I will change for you. I just need to really hear it clearly. Okay, so then people might start pursuing more outside involvements if things don't get better, right? They might be putting their energy into friendships, or spending more time at work or with the kids, more extracurricular activities. This could be the time of affairs too. But there's basically increasing distance between the marital partners. And then, around this time also, there's more of a negative storytelling. It's accentuating the negatives in the relationship. They think of all the things that haven't been great, and they're really kind of minimizing the positive. It's pretty much the opposite of what we do when we fall in love. When we fall in love, we just I see all the positive things, and we ignore all the annoying things. Now, anything that used to be endearing is annoying, and we can maybe even rewrite the history of the relationship. When I was working as a couples therapist, the standard question is to ask how they met, ask a little about their history. And if you hear a negative story, if they've already restoried their meeting as more negative, then you know that they're pretty, somebody's got one foot out the door, maybe more than one person. And then eventually they're deciding to separate and asking for a separation. And the person who's thinking about that, they might go through the motions for some time and pretend that things are okay, but they're kind of, again, distancing themselves before they bring it up. Sometimes the other person sees this coming and it's kind of mutual or expected, and sometimes the other person is just totally caught off guard. And unfortunately, this is often when people call for therapy, basically after they've gone through all this and somebody's like, my wife just told me she wants a divorce, and so now we want to come to therapy. And that's tough as a couples therapist because, yeah, this one person has already got kind of a big foot outside the door. So, and of course, once someone divorces, as some of these other research studies will indicate, yeah, everything changes. Money changes, friendships change, your daily life, your sex life, your relationship with your kids, if you have them, everything's going to be reorganized. So whereas Diane Bond's research was before divorce, this is post-divorce across all age groups, all adults. And so you can see some of the hallmarks were just a lot of intense emotion, things like hatred and fear and guilt, loss of self-esteem or self-confidence. If there's kids involved, there's almost always stress around the kids. Increased risk of mental and physical health issues. So for example, if there was infidelity, you're more likely to be experiencing PTSD if you were not the affair partner, if you were the betrayed partner. Higher rates of depression. Your health is more likely to be compromised, similar to following a death. Your immune system just isn't functioning as well. You are going through that loss of attachment bond, which we know the attachment system is located in your brain, and losing an attachment figure is like pain in your brain, essentially, whether that's due to death or divorce. Generally, the person initiating the divorce fares better. Not that that's a cakewalk at all. So it's better to be the dumper than the dumpy. Okay, so this is focused on emerging and young adult women, so ages 23 to 32, who had experienced divorce. This is a qualitative study of just 9 of these women, so a pretty small sample size. And here were the 5 themes that came up from their interviews. And you can be thinking about your own kind of breakups and which of these resonate with you. So the first one was kind of unmoored and uncertain about the future. So I thought I had a plan, who I was going to be with, and maybe I was planning on kids and, creating a future together, and now that's, blown apart. The second one is retrospective red flags and painful realities. So realizing, in hindsight, I can see that things weren't great, but I didn't want to see it, And then that painful reality of like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is where I'm at, my expectations, my dreams, my hopes, they're all failed. Or maybe I had expectations for fidelity and that didn't happen. Then the third one is revisiting self. Some said, for example, they lost themselves during the marriage, and so there was a necessary time of self-reflection and to be more true to themselves. There was, of course, embarrassment at failing at marriage and a fear of being judged personally or professionally. And then the last one is about rebuilding and opportunities for growth. So focusing on education or therapy or friendships or family. Opportunities for growth, essentially. So on that note is this TED Talk, which you could watch just a few minutes of if you'd like. It's optional, about breakups not having to leave you broken, by Gary Lewandowski. And so he emphasizes that, for some people, relationship breakup can be pretty positive, especially when they do focus on that rediscovery of self. This was another qualitative research study. This one was on divorced individuals during midlife, another small one, just 14 individuals. And there were 4 themes. So I've got 2 on this slide and 2 on the next. So, and this is post-divorce. So the first one was around time, that came up a lot in the interviews. And so in addition to the quote you can see on the slide, another one was, I'm reminding myself that there's a bigger plan, that what I'm going through now is temporary. Another theme was emotional pain. Yeah. So if you go through a divorce and you have loved someone, you're vulnerable, you're crushed, and the world is suddenly a really different place. Or another person said, it seems like I've been through hell and back, literally, but I survived. So, two themes, time and emotional pain. So the last two themes in this qualitative research study were changes in parenting. So because this was midlife, many people had parents. And so you can see they were talking about like, wow, being a single parent, that's tough. And then the last theme was this theme of starting over. And so sometimes that was positive, like, wow, my life is so peaceful now. Or sometimes, that was more like a sense of like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to spend the rest of my life? This last slide is on the divorce or uncoupling process later in life. The divorce rate in older adulthood is lower than in the younger years, but it is rising. There's basically, if we oversimplify, two trajectories towards divorce in late adulthood. Either one where I'm kind of falling out of love, just got bored, we grew apart, we're not the same people we were when we met, whatever, 40 years ago. Or it could be more of like, I've been putting up with bad experiences for a long time and I'm just done with it. Either way, there's, following the divorce, there's money concerns, especially for older women who might not have the earning power. Your assets are split in half too. Higher rates of loneliness, social isolation, and depression, and things that we worry about. But there can also be a sense of relief if you were living in an unhappy relationship for decades. All right, it was another long one. You made it to the end. Good job.